Good afternoon. We are here today for another installment of BPC's continuing effort to understand ESG. I'm Tim Doyle, Senior Advisor here at BPC, and we are incredibly fortunate to have a Security and Exchange Commissioner, Hester Peirce. Commissioner Peirce, welcome and thank you for agreeing to be on the show.
Thank you, Tim. It's great to be here with the Bipartisan Policy Center. I'm grateful for the opportunity, and I do have to start with my disclaimer, of course, which is that my views are my own views, not necessarily those of the SEC or my fellow commissioners.
Perfect. Thank you. Today, for those tuning in, we are addressing greenwashing. This is an issue that's becoming increasingly discussed in the context of ESG. And for those who have been following our program here at BPC, you know that ESG has become a term that has attracted hundreds of billions of dollars in investment, and asset managers with assets under management now, I think, in excess of $20 trillion, that's right, with a T, today use some form of ESG strategy. In short, there is an awful lot of money surrounding ESG. As for greenwashing, I think I can generally say that it is said that some people look at greenwashing from a perspective of companies not being honest with either intentionally or unintentionally with investors or the public about their sustainability efforts. However, there's another aspect of greenwashing that not a lot of people know, but it's becoming bigger and bigger, and that is thinking of greenwashing as muddying the water around ESG funds and ESG strategies. Today, we are going to focus on this latter point. From that perspective, it certainly appears that the Security and Exchange Commission's proposed names and ESG disclosure rules are becoming ground zero for the greenwashing debate. I know, Commissioner Peirce, that you've been considering these issues for what seems like years now, and was hoping that you could give us a little bit of background on the SEC's role, and specifically on start with the names rule.
Well, thanks, Tim. And I think as you started out saying, this is big business now. ESG investing is big business, and so that is why the SEC is paying more attention to it now, because it's attracting a lot of assets under management. And the concern, as you laid out, is that is a fund that's marketing itself as being ESG living up to what it says it's doing, or is it just is the asset manager just enjoying the higher fee for managing a supposedly ESG fund, but not actually managing the fund in a way that is consistent with that promise to investors? So I think we can all agree on the problem that we're trying to solve, but the issue then comes with the question of how do you go about solving that problem? How do you go about making sure that investment advisors are being candid with their investors so that their investors can choose funds that fit their interests and their needs? And I would argue that we can solve that problem with our existing rule set. We have the authority to go after advisors who are not being truthful about what it is they're selling, what services they're offering. And so I don't know that we need to do a rule change, but my colleagues on the commission have decided that there are a couple different ways to approach this problem of greenwashing, and those are the two ways that you mentioned. So that it's the names rule and a rule it's the companion rule to the rule set that we're doing for public companies. We did a climate rule for public companies. This is kind of the companion on the advisor side, the ESG rule for advisors. So with respect to the names rule, the names rule is about 2 decades old, and the idea behind that rule is if you're going to name your fund something, then you need to make sure that what's in the fund actually matches that name. And so the names rule imposes an 80% requirement to say that 80% of your portfolio has to have that link to the name. The question arises after 2 decades: do we think that names rule is living up to its name, right? Do we think it's doing what it's supposed to do? And this revamp that we proposed earlier this year would tighten the restrictions. It would apply that 80% requirement to a larger set of funds. It's not an ESG only rule. This is a rule that applies broadly to names. And so it would pull in all kinds of names into the rule. Now, if you have a fund that's a growth fund, that would be covered by the names rule. So it's not only based on the type of security, but kind of the type of strategy that you employ if you're an advisor. So it really changes the substance of the rule in a pretty dramatic way. And what you'll have to do as an advisor is you'll have to be able to pinpoint which investments fit within that bucket and tied to, for example, a growth strategy. So we've gotten actually a lot of feedback on the rule. One of the concerns is that we've tightened the requirements in the sense that if you want to depart from those from your name with your portfolio investments, you're limited in the time that you can stray away from that name. So we're tying the hands of advisors much more closely or much more tightly than we did under the existing iteration of the names rule. And so we've gotten a lot of feedback about how that would make it really difficult, not only for ESG advisors, but for other advisors to stay in compliance with the rule.
No, so let me ask you that. So if this is broader than ESG, is there something else that's driving the proposed change now?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I really do think greenwashing is what is the impetus for the change or concerns around greenwashing, but I think it's also the fact that the rule is 2 decades old, and so taking a look at it. But really, I would say the main impetus is concerns around greenwashing.
Right, and I know in the past you've made some comments that, and we obviously started the segment off talking about the amount of money. I mean, there's literally billions and billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars involved here. And I think you've made some comments, and I know others have, that in Wall Street you put ESG on a fund, or you put it as part of a strategy, and not only will it by its name be able to raise more money, but you'll be able to use that name because of its broad nature. It will free you up to kind of do what you want, because so many things fall under the ESG umbrella.
Well, and that's such an important point, that the term ESG is not defined, and it's not defined in either of the 2 rules I mentioned, this names rule or this other ESG for advisors rule. And part of me thinks, well, we really need to define it, because we're putting all these rules around it. But at the same time, if you try to define it, then we as the regulator end up kind of dictating what ESG means. And I think in the ideal world, you have advisors, all of whom are approaching advising in whatever way they think is right. And if they think an ESG strategy is right and they have a way to pursue that strategy, we want to make sure they tell investors what their way of approaching that strategy is, but we don't want to confine them and say, well, this is what ESG means to us. But these 2 rules are going to get us into some very difficult areas, because I think we are going to be called upon, if the rules get implemented, we are going to be called upon to make judgment calls about whether we think that the advisor made a good judgment call.
Right, and I know you had indicated it before, but there are obviously rules already on the book. In fact, I know that there are enforcement actions that are ongoing. when it comes to this, it would seem that the real emphasis, if you really look down, and I know you talk about it quite a bit, is the SEC's mission is to really inform the investors. And so that if an investment advisor or somebody that's putting together an investment fund explains how they are applying in their explanation, describe what ESG means to them, and then how they're going to apply it, it would seem that that's really what the focus should be on, if in fact the end goal is to just inform the investor.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think one of the concerns is that the investors do sometimes look to a name and they make assumptions about what's in the fund. And so there's a concern that, can you be more strict about requiring the name to tie to the fund? But I think the other message that we hear a lot is, look, a name is one thing investors look at, but we really need to encourage investors to look beyond just the name. there's only so much you can say in that name. And so allowing advisors to explain what it is they're doing, and not link that. So, just have the name, put so much emphasis on the name.
Yeah, and it's interesting when it comes to defining, not defining. At BPC, we have literally spent the last 2 years trying to help explain what ESG is to the average person, at least here in Washington, if you consider that an average person. And it's amazing the different opinions we get back about what other people think ESG is. And so to your point about being difficult in describing ESG, I will, in doing some research recently, I noticed the Federal Trade Commission obviously focuses on misleading labels for companies. So on that first aspect, we talked about greenwashing. And yet I looked at some of their guidance that they put out, and they specifically don't enforce or have a definition for sustainability, because the argument, or what they've claimed, is that because it could be conflicting with other federal agencies, they don't use that as a term that they're going to enforce. And I kind of scratch my head. I'm like, is sustainability? I mean, that is, if there is one term, I mean, that is the term that people are concerned with. But I mean, I guess that just shows that it's a lot more complicated than just saying, oh, ESG is environment, social, and governance, and kind of end it there.
Well, I think one of the difficulties is that, even recently we've seen that the terms ESG are changing, they're morphing, they're including more things. A lot of people maybe 5 years ago would have thought the E only really related to greenhouse gases, whereas today a lot of people will say, no, the E also includes biodiversity, or sustainability of water resources, whatever it is, you can fit in there. And so the E morphs out, and then the S issues also morph out. And then you see something like the war in Ukraine happening, and you start to see people say, well, we actually see that maybe weapons manufacturers need to be shifted over into a different category. Or you start to learn about new consequences of a different energy source that maybe you didn't think about, or you think about how are people disposing of batteries for electric cars, or which bucket does nuclear fit in. So there's a lot of reason why it's very difficult to pin these things down. And I think one other piece of it that's important to remember is that if you really are trying to solve something, you're trying to address a problem like climate change, you want to make sure that capital can flow to the solutions to those problems, right? And we might see today the solution to climate change is a shift to solar or wind or whatever you want to, or nuclear, whatever. But it may be that someone else comes up in 5 or 10 years from now, a totally different solution to climate change issues that we hadn't thought about. And if you have your rules set up in a way that it nudges capital to one direction, then you could end up actually preventing a solution from being developed. And that's why I think these rules are really important. Our advisor rules and the names rule, the ESG for advisors rule, are really important, because if we get it wrong, we could actually aggravate the problems that we're seeing instead of end up directing capital to solve those problems.
Right. Well, I know that really goes to kind of the heart of, I guess, some fundamental issues about how the SEC should handle these, between a kind of a rules-based as opposed to a principles-based approach to the problems. And it sounds like, at least in the example you gave, that a principles-based approach would probably be better because it would leave more options open. Of course, the other side of it is, if you leave it to principles-based, then some companies are going to use that and then not disclose certain information.
Well, and I think so let me talk briefly about the ESG for advisors rule. We try to break up funds into, I should say, ESG for advisors and investment companies. The goal is to break up the funds into ESG focused funds. Well, ESG integration funds are funds where ESG is a factor, it's considered, but it's not determinative. ESG focused funds, it's sort of one of the main considerations in managing the money. And then ESG impact funds you're actually trying to achieve an ESG objective in addition to, or maybe instead of, but a financial return. And so the idea is to try to shoehorn funds into those buckets, and then disclosure obligations will follow depending on which bucket you're in. But one of the things that, and one of the reasons for that is what you were just alluding to, which is you could end up if in a principles-based world, you could end up in a situation where it's one, there you could be allowing people to greenwash, but two, you could make it more difficult to compare across funds and advisors. And there's this desire for comparability. But I think what we end up doing with a very prescriptive approach, such as the one we're taking, I would characterize it as prescriptive. You could end up in a situation where you get sort of fake comparability, where you think things are comparable, but actually underneath the surface, there's a lot of guesswork going into, or approximation going into how disclosures are made. So you might not get that level of comparability, which is why I think we should be open-minded about a more principles-based approach that really says to advisors, you have to tell people what you're doing, and we take that seriously, but we're not going to try to tell you that to be an ESG environmental fund, you have to disclose greenhouse gas emissions, because you might be an environmental fund that for which that's not important. Or we're not going to tell you, as the rule would do, that you have to have a certain number of engagements with issuers and document those engagements. That's a very prescriptive approach. So I will say, just as a blanket point, our comment periods are closed on both of these rules, I believe. But we have not moved to final yet, and so we've gotten a ton of really good comments on both of the rules, and very thoughtful comments. So we're taking those into consideration now. But I think what the comments highlight is that this is really hard. Doing this kind of rulemaking is not easy, and so it's really helpful to have all that input so that we can think through how to move forward or whether to move forward.
Right. And I know many have recently said that the SEC, the Commission, is on a record pace for proposals. How, I guess this is more of a how you're handling it. How do you see, for instance, these types of rules moving forward, given all the other work, in particular the very large, I think, climate rule that I know you all are working on? How does that fit in from, I guess it's more of a procedural or practical?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of rules going on that we're considering now at the proposal stage or the adoption stage. And that means that everyone is working very hard at the Commission, but it also means that we're trying to get input from outside on a lot of different rules at the same time, which is difficult. And we're trying to get people to figure out how those rules will interact with each other. And I'm glad you brought up the climate rule for public companies, because the climate rule for the ESG rule for advisors and funds sort of presumes there's going to be the climate rule is going to be adopted, but it's hard for people to know what to say on the advisor fund side without really knowing how that climate rule is going to be finalized. And on that one, I think we got something like 14,000 comments. So
yes,
there's a lot of reading going on at the Commission right now to get through all those letters. So it's a difficult, it's always hard to figure out how to stage rules, but I'm always arguing that we need to take this very deliberately, because if we don't, we could end up imposing massive costs on the industry and ultimately on investors, and maybe it won't get us where we want to go. And that's another piece of this, that all of this is going to take a long time to implement, because if the names rule were to go into place the way it is now, or the ESG for advisors and funds, there would be a lot of changes to a lot of funds and a lot of disclosure changes, but also substantive changes. And so that is going to take a long time and a lot of work and a lot of expense.
Right. One thing I know that you've said publicly in your statements regarding, actually, I think it's actually more than a couple of different rules, is the direction the Commission seems to be going, in that it's not just disclosure rules, but it's almost something akin to disclosure plus. That it's yes, you have to disclose this, but you also have to do something else to be in compliance with the rule, which is a little bit more than disclosure. I was wondering if you could just briefly address that.
Yeah, I think sometimes we characterize something as a disclosure rule, but what it essentially does is it says, well, by putting the focus on the disclosure of a particular issue, it basically forces companies or advisors or funds to do what you're telling them to disclose. And so whether that's, in this area, I mentioned engagements with issuers where there's some pretty prescriptive requirements, or around proxy voting. And again, it's sort of us making the assumption that if you are one of these kinds of funds, that proxy voting is going to be a big way for you to achieve the ends you're trying to achieve. So I think we have to be careful when we craft something, even as a disclosure requirement. We have to be careful to not let that become a de facto substantive requirement.
Right. And another issue I know, I guess in the past you touched on, and that really gets into conflicts of interest. I know there's been in the last probably year or so, there's been an uptick in criticism of ESG, and it seems like there's a growing sense that some of that has to do with conflicts of interest, in particular with some of our larger institutional investors having essentially just different clients, different fiduciaries to different parties that have kind of different opinions. How do you see that, or how do you think the commission is going to address that, or if they will?
Well, I like how you asked that question, because I think that is the key, right? As a fiduciary, as an asset manager, you are a fiduciary to your client. And a client for an asset manager could be an individual, but it could, or a pension fund, or an investment company, a mutual fund. But the point is that you can be an advisor to multiple clients who have different objectives, and you have to manage for the particular objective of the particular client. We often talk about large asset managers as if they're a monolith, right? That they have control over X number or X percentage of a company's shares, when in reality, that may be the case, but they may in that represent many different clients. So you could even see within a large asset manager, you could see them voting different shares different ways, depending on what the objectives of that particular client is. And so I think we over time, have sort of gotten a little sloppy with how we talk about that. And I think we need to be more specific, because it's so important to remember that the vote ultimately belongs to the fund or to the individual that you work for.
Right. And I know that, for instance, one of those large institutional investors, BlackRock, has recently indicated that they have given, or that they are in the process of trying to give certain clients the ability to vote, tell them how they should be voting within certain in certain, we'll call it annual shareholder meetings. But it would seem that would, again, if they start doing that, what happens if you have two separate investors say, we want you to vote a different way than you are, and then there's, as you well know and talked about, there's so much more than just the vote. There's meeting with the individual companies and trying to influence them in a way that as an institutional investor, you think that company should be run. I mean, it just seems like that is a difficult situation to be put in.
Well, I think for fiduciaries, it is hard when they're representing multiple different objectives and they're going and talking to an issuer. That is difficult. Now, with respect to, if you're talking about a fund and you're talking about multiple investors in a fund, when investors come together and they pool their money in a fund, they unite around a particular objective. And that's why it's so important to have that objective very clearly disclosed. But really, I might be in the fund and you might be in the fund, and we might have very different views about lots of things, but we've just come together and agreed that we share this objective. And so it really has to be based on the fund's objectives, and not even individual investors might have conflicting investor interests, but they all agree on that one objective.
And lastly, Commissioner, again, thank you so much for your time. we're kind of coming into as we like to say in DC, to the crazy season with the elections coming up. But even more so than that, we have, as I mentioned earlier, there seems to be an uptick in criticism and ESG. Do you think that will continue, or do you think it's just the time of season it is, and that come January things might settle back down?
Well, Tim, I think it's somewhat a reaction to the idea that we don't, so many areas of our lives are politicized now, and one reason that I love the agency that I work for and the capital markets that we regulate is because they do enable us to get capital into the hands of people who need it to build businesses, which will then support their communities and enable investors to take their hard-earned money and join in that process of building businesses. It's a beautiful thing, right? And it's not an inherently political thing. It's something that all Americans can unite around. And I think when Americans see their capital markets becoming politicized, there's an inherent reaction against that, right? Because this is one area of our lives where we can really come together and work together to build a better country together. And that's what I want to do. And I want us to write the rules that facilitate that.
Wonderful. Yes, absolutely. And again, thank you, Commissioner Peirce. We here at BPC, we are in this ESG program we have now been working on for the last few years. One of our focuses is trying to get bipartisan support for some reasonable discussion, if you will. And sometimes it's more difficult, as I mentioned, in the political season than others, but that is definitely a focus of ours. We think that there is a good middle space there for thought leaders, for commissioners, for elected officials to really engage on this, because and I'm sure Commissioner Peirce, you agree, ESG is not going away. It will be with us for quite some time.
Well, it's certainly not going away, Tim. And as we discussed, they're difficult issues. So I appreciate your input and appreciate the chance to talk to you about it today.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Commissioner.
Thanks.
And
Tim.
again, for those that have been following us at BPC, this is yet another one of our series that we are doing on ESG. We will certainly have more and look forward to seeing you all in the next rendition. Thank you very much.